The noise of New York City was a constant hum, a symphony of honking taxis, chattering pedestrians, and the distant blare of subway trains. It was a chaotic energy that somehow felt familiar to Lon as she navigated the crowded streets. She had only arrived from her hometown in California a few days ago, eager to explore the bustling city. But today, the noise was interrupted by something far more jarring, something that would change the course of her trip. Lon was walking down a busy street in Manhattan, her eyes scanning the skyline and her phone in hand, recording a video of the towering buildings around her. She had been in the city for a few days now, visiting some friends and taking in the sights, but today, she was just enjoying the moment, a brief escape from the whirlwind of life. Her thoughts were interrupted when she saw something in her peripheral vision. A blur of movement. A dog. It happened too quickly. One moment, the dog was trotting along the sidewalk, and the next, it darted into the road, directly in the path of an oncoming car. The screech of brakes filled the air, but it was too late. The vehicle collided with the small animal with a sickening thud, sending it tumbling across the pavement like a ragdoll. Lon froze for a moment, her heart racing. She had witnessed the whole thing from a distance, but she could barely process what had just happened. The car quickly sped off, its driver seemingly unaware or indifferent to the accident they had just caused. The dog lay motionless on the ground, its body twisted at an unnatural angle. Without thinking, Lan's feet moved on their own. She dropped her phone into her bag and rushed toward the injured animal, her breath shallow and rapid. Her mind screamed for her to act, to help, but a part of her was paralyzed with fear. What if the dog was beyond saving? What if she was making it worse by moving it? But there was no time for doubt. The dog was struggling to breathe, its eyes wide and filled with pain. Lon knelt beside the animal, her hands shaking as she gently touched its fur. The dog whimpered softly, and Lan's heart cracked. "Hey, it's okay," she whispered, though she had no idea if the dog could even hear her. She scanned the street, looking for anyone who might be able to help. Pedestrians walked by, some with brief glances toward the injured animal before turning their attention back to their busy lives. Lon felt a pang of frustration. Why wasn't anyone stopping? The dog whimpered again, its body trembling, and that was all Lon needed to push past her hesitation. She was the only one here. She couldn't just leave it to suffer. Lon checked her surroundings quickly, taking in the busy traffic and crowded sidewalks, before deciding to do something that seemed both logical and absurd at the same time. She pulled out her phone and started recording the dog, capturing the injury and the pain. She didn't know why she felt the need to film, but it felt like the right thing to do, like she needed to document this moment, as if it might help somehow. As she recorded, she spoke into the camera. "I'm going to get help. Stay with me," she murmured. With trembling hands, she reached into her bag and pulled out her wallet to find her emergency credit card, then dialed the nearest animal hospital. The line rang for what felt like an eternity, but a voice finally answered. "Animal Emergency Center. How can I help you?" "I need help," Lon said, her voice tight. "There's a dog on the street, it's been hit by a car, and it looks like it's badly injured. I'm not sure what to do, but I don't want to just leave it here." The person on the other end responded with calm professionalism. "We can send someone to help. Where exactly are you?" Lon quickly gave the street name and crossed streets, her eyes never leaving the dog. She reached out and gently stroked its head, trying to comfort it. The animal, still alive but barely moving, let out another pitiful whine. "Please hurry," Lon pleaded, her voice breaking. "It's hurt really bad." The operator assured her help was on the way, but Lon knew it could take a while for the response team to arrive. She couldn't just stand there. She needed to do something now. Thinking quickly, Lon lifted the dog as gently as she could, trying not to cause further pain. The animal barely stirred, its breathing shallow and ragged. She wrapped it in her scarf to keep it warm, trying to shield it from the cold air that bit through her jacket. She then carefully began walking toward the animal hospital. Each step felt like an eternity, but she refused to stop. The animal hospital wasn't far, but as she walked through the streets, she couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that gnawed at her. What would happen to the dog? Would it survive? Was it too late? Her mind raced with questions, but all she could do was keep moving, one foot in front of the other. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Lon arrived at the animal hospital. A staff member quickly rushed out to help her, guiding her into the emergency treatment area. They gently took the dog from her arms, placing it on a stretcher and rushing it inside. Lon followed closely behind, her heart still pounding in her chest. "Don't worry," the nurse reassured her as they disappeared into the back. "We'll do everything we can for this little one." Lon nodded, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders, but still unsure of what to expect. She had done everything she could, but she didn't know if it would be enough. She sat down in the waiting area, her mind swirling with thoughts. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at it. It was a text from her friend back in California, asking how her trip was going. Lan's fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she didn't respond. Her mind was elsewhere. It was with the dog, the fragile creature that had somehow found its way into her heart in the span of just a few minutes. And as she sat there, she couldn't help but wonder just how much this chance encounter would change her life. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, mingling with the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Lon sat in a quiet corner of the animal clinic, her fingers nervously tapping against the armrest of the plastic chair. She had been here for what felt like hours, though it had only been a short while since they took Tiao Tiao to the back for treatment. Each minute that ticked by felt heavier, and the silence of the waiting room did little to ease the anxiety building in her chest. Tiao Tiao had been a lifeless weight in her arms as they rushed into the clinic, but now, the dog was in the hands of the professionals. Lon couldn't help but feel helpless. The thought of the small, injured animal she had barely known, yet felt inexplicably drawn to, lying alone in a sterile treatment room made her stomach churn. She tried to distract herself by scrolling through her phone, but nothing seemed to hold her attention. She couldn't shake the image of Tiao Tiao's pain-ridden eyes from her mind. Lon had been to New York many times before, but she had never experienced anything like this. It wasn't just the shock of the accident. It was the responsibility that seemed to weigh her down, as if fate had brought her here, at this moment, for a reason. A soft click of the door broke through her thoughts, and she looked up to see a man step into the room. He was tall, with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, his white lab coat buttoned neatly over his shirt. He looked to be in his late 30s, and there was a calmness about him that immediately put Lon at ease. "Ms. Lon?" he asked, his voice deep and reassuring. Lon stood quickly, her heart racing. "Yes, that's me. How's the dog? Is she going to be okay?" The veterinarian gave a small smile, though his eyes reflected a seriousness that Lon didn't like. "I'm Dr. Fook. I've had a chance to examine the dog, and I'm afraid the situation is quite serious." Lan's breath caught in her throat. She could feel her pulse quickening as she waited for him to continue. She had been bracing herself for the worst, but hearing the words spoken aloud made it all too real. "Her name is Tiao Tiao," Lon said, almost reflexively. The dog had somehow already become so much more than just an injured stray. "What happened to her? Can you help her?" Dr. Fook nodded gravely, his gaze softening. "We've run some initial tests, and the injury appears to be more severe than we anticipated. She's suffered significant damage to her spinal cord, most likely from the impact of the car. Unfortunately, the damage is extensive enough that she's paralyzed." Lan's stomach twisted. Paralyzed. The word echoed in her mind, and she felt as though the ground had been ripped from beneath her feet. How could this happen to a helpless creature? And what could she do to help? "She'll need immediate care," Dr. Fook continued, his voice steady. "We can begin treatment right away, but I'll be honest, her chances of recovery depend on the severity of the nerve damage. Right now, we can manage her pain and keep her comfortable, but whether or not she will ever regain movement is uncertain." Lan's mind raced, but she felt a lump form in her throat. The idea that Tiao Tiao could never walk again, never run or play like other dogs, was almost too much to bear. The thought of the dog's suffering of its pain was almost unbearable. I understand," Lon said, her voice thick with emotion. She stood there for a moment, trying to steady her breath. "But I won't give up on her. I'll do whatever it takes." Dr. Fook observed her carefully, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, a faint smile crept onto his face. "You're a good person, Lon. Many people would have walked away by now, but you didn't. You're choosing to fight for this little one. That means a lot. Lan's heart warmed at his words, though the weight of the situation still lingered. She had never been one to back down from a challenge, but this was different. This wasn't just about helping a stray dog. It was about taking responsibility for another life, a life that depended on her. And yet, despite the enormity of the decision, something inside her knew she couldn't turn away now. I want to adopt her, Lan said, surprising even herself with the clarity in her voice. I want to take her home with me. I'll make sure she gets the care she needs. I won't let her suffer. Dr. Fook looked at her, clearly moved. Are you sure about this? He asked gently. Taking care of a paralyzed animal is a huge responsibility. It's not going to be easy. There will be a lot of care required, from physical therapy to special accommodations. But if you're willing to commit, I'll help guide you through it. Lan nodded without hesitation. I'm sure. She needs me, and I won't let her go through this alone. Dr. Fook studied her for a moment longer before giving a slow nod. All right, we'll do everything we can to help Tiao Tiao, and I'll help you every step of the way. The weight of the decision hung heavy on Lan's shoulders, but for the first time since the accident, she felt a sense of determination rising within her. She wasn't sure what the future held, or how long it would take, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let Tiao Tiao suffer, not if she could help it. As the conversation turned toward the specifics of Tiao Tiao's care plan, Lan's thoughts drifted for a moment, her gaze lingering on the dog's gentle face. Despite the paralysis, despite the uncertainty of the road ahead, she could see the spark of life in the dog's eyes. Tiao Tiao wasn't ready to give up, and neither was Lan. It was a quiet evening in New York City, the kind where the city's usual hustle seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the soft hum of distant traffic and the occasional murmur of passers-by. Lan had spent the day with Tiao Tiao, her newly adopted dog, and for the first time since the accident, she felt a sense of peace. The dog had made great progress in the few days she had been with Lan. She was eating well, settling into her new environment, and despite her paralysis, Tiao Tiao had started showing glimpses of her old personality. Lan often found herself talking to the dog, sharing her day with her, even though she knew the dog couldn't respond. But the connection between them was real. Tiao Tiao was no longer just a stray. She was a part of Lan's life now. Lan was sitting in her small apartment, scrolling through her phone, when it rang. The screen displayed an unknown number. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure whether she should answer. It wasn't uncommon to get spam calls, especially in a city as large as New York. But something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the timing, or maybe her instincts told her to pick up. She pressed the button, bringing the phone to her ear. Hello? She answered, trying to sound casual. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then a voice, low and strained, came through the speaker. Lan, you don't know me, but you need to listen to me very carefully. I know about the dog you just adopted, Tiao Tiao. Lan's blood ran cold at the mention of her dog's name. How could this stranger know about her? She had barely told anyone about her new pet, other than a few close friends. Who is this? She asked, her voice tight with suspicion. The voice was calm but urgent. That dog, Tiao Tiao, may not have been an ordinary stray. She could very well be the victim of something much darker, something dangerous. An illegal animal trafficking ring is operating in the city, and your dog might be connected to it. Lan's heart began to race. The words felt like a punch to her gut. Animal trafficking? What was this person talking about? I don't understand, Lan replied, trying to steady her voice. Tiao Tiao was just a dog hit by a car. I found her on the street and That's exactly what they want you to think, the voice interrupted, urgency creeping into its tone. They use accidents, they make it seem like the animals are abandoned, but in truth, they've been taken from their homes, or worse, tortured. These traffickers have a network in the city. They're selling animals to buyers who use them for experiments, for profit, or worse, for cruel purposes. Lan felt a lump rise in her throat. She thought about Tiao Tiao's injury, the old wound on her body, the scars that had seemed out of place. She had been so focused on helping her dog heal that she hadn't questioned where Tiao Tiao had come from. But now, the dots were starting to connect in a way that sent chills down her spine. How do you know all of this? Lon asked, her voice barely a whisper. She was still reeling from the revelation, trying to process the information. The voice on the other end didn't answer right away. There was a long pause, and when it finally spoke, it was quieter, almost as though the person was afraid someone might overhear. I used to be involved in their operations. I got out, but I know what they're capable of. I know how they work. They've been taking dogs and other animals from the streets, from people's homes, and selling them to whoever will buy. You can't trust the shelters, you can't trust the rescues. They're all part of it. I don't know what happened to Tiao Tiao before she ended up with you, but I'm telling you, she's part of something bigger. Lan's mind was spinning. She sat down on the couch, clutching her phone tightly as if it might slip from her hands. Could this really be true? Could Tiao Tiao have been a victim of something so vile? Her eyes instinctively drifted to the dog, who was resting on her bed, her body curled in a comfortable, peaceful position. Tiao Tiao was so small, so fragile, and yet the thought of her being a victim of a cruel trafficking network made Lan's stomach churn with disgust. What should I do? Lan asked, her voice strained. How can I help her? The voice was quiet for a moment, as though considering her question carefully. You need to be careful. These people are dangerous. If they think you know too much, or if they realize you're interfering with their business, they'll come after you. They'll do whatever it takes to silence you. But you can't just ignore this. You need to find out the truth about where Tiao Tiao came from. I'm giving you a warning. You're in too deep now, and once you've learned the truth, there's no turning back. Lan's heart pounded in her chest. The weight of the warning was heavy, and yet, deep down, she knew she couldn't back away from it. Tiao Tiao had already found her, and there was no way she could turn her back now. What should I do next? Lan asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The voice on the other end hesitated. I can't say much more right now, but I'm going to send you a message with a name, someone who might be able to help you. Trust no one. Keep your eyes open. And remember, if they think you're getting too close to the truth, they'll come for you too. Before Lan could respond, there was a soft click on the other end of the line, and the call abruptly ended. She sat there in stunned silence, the words echoing in her mind. Her grip on the phone tightened, and her breath was shallow as she tried to process everything she had just learned. An illegal animal trafficking ring. A dog caught in the middle. Was Tiao Tiao really a victim? And if so, who could she trust to help her? Lan didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear. This was just the beginning. She had a choice now. She could ignore the warning and try to move on with her life. Or she could follow the trail, take the risk, and find out the truth. She glanced over at Tiao Tiao, who was peacefully asleep, unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. In that moment, Lan knew there was no turning back. She would do whatever it took to uncover the truth and protect Tiao Tiao. The following morning, Lan woke up feeling like a weight was pressing down on her chest. The mysterious phone call from the night before had shaken her, leaving her with a mix of disbelief and determination. She couldn't simply ignore the warning. If there was even a chance that Tiao Tiao had been a victim of something as sinister as an animal trafficking ring, she had to find out the truth. There was no turning back. Lan glanced at Tiao Tiao, who was resting on the couch, her paralyzed legs stretched out in front of her. The dog was so trusting, so innocent, and it broke Lan's heart to think that someone could harm her for profit. She wasn't going to let that happen. The first person Lan turned to for help was Dr. Fook. He had been the one to diagnose Tiao Tiao's injury, and despite his professional distance, there was a warmth in his demeanor that had made her feel like she wasn't alone in this. He had been kind, understanding, and most importantly, he had the expertise she needed. Lan made her way to the clinic where Dr. Fook worked. When she entered, the familiar smell of disinfectant and the soft sounds of animals in the background comforted her slightly. She found Dr. Fook in the back office, looking over some medical charts. Dr. Fook, Lan began, her voice steady but with a hint of urgency. I need your help. I got a call last night from someone anonymous. They told me that Tiao Tiao might be part of an illegal animal trafficking operation. They said she could have been taken off the streets, or worse, used for some horrible purpose. Dr. Fook looked up from his paperwork, his face instantly softening with concern. I'm glad you came to me with this, Lan. But are you sure the person wasn't just trying to scare you? Sometimes, People like to create panic without any real reason. Still, he paused, his brow furrowing. We can't ignore anything when it comes to the safety of animals. Let me see what I can do to help. Lon felt a rush of relief wash over her. Thank you, Dr. Fook. I'm not sure what to believe yet, but I need to know if Tiao Tiao's situation is part of something bigger. If she was a victim of this trafficking, I have to do something. Dr. Fook stood up, his expression thoughtful. I have a friend, Hong. He's an old colleague from Vietnam, and now he works as a detective in the NYPD. I trust him, and he might be able to help us investigate this further. Lon nodded, eager to take the next step. I'll do whatever it takes to get to the truth. The two of them made plans to meet Hong later that afternoon at a small cafe on the outskirts of Manhattan, away from the crowds and prying eyes. When they arrived, Hong was already seated at a corner table. He was a tall man with a sharp, observant gaze that seemed to take in everything at once. His dark hair was slightly messy, as though he had just come from a long day on the job. When he saw Dr. Fook, he broke into a warm smile. Fook, it's good to see you, Hong said, standing to shake his friend's hand. I wasn't expecting this, but I'm glad you called. Dr. Fook gestured to Lon. Hong, this is Lon. She's been helping an injured dog, Tiao Tiao, and she believes the dog might be connected to something much bigger, a potential animal trafficking ring. Lon, this is Hong, one of the best detectives I know. Lon extended her hand, trying to mask her nerves with a smile. It's nice to meet you, Hong. I hope we can find some answers. Hong studied her for a moment before shaking her hand. I'm happy to help. If there's something going on in this city, we'll find it. Once they were seated, Hong leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he listened to the details of Lan's situation. She explained the phone call, her suspicions about Tiao Tiao's injury, and the possible connection to an underground trafficking operation. Hong didn't interrupt, but Lon could see his mind working as he processed the information. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment, tapping his fingers on the table. I've heard rumors about animal trafficking rings in the city, Hong said finally, but finding concrete evidence is another thing. We've had reports of missing animals, dogs, cats, and even some exotic species, but there's no solid proof linking it all together. The authorities don't have much to go on, and the shelters haven't been able to connect the dots either. There's too much secrecy around it. Lon felt a sense of frustration welling up inside her. But there has to be something. This isn't just about a few missing pets. There are lives at stake. Tiao Tiao could be just one of many victims. Dr. Fook nodded in agreement. We need to dig deeper, see if we can find some common thread. If animals are being taken and sold to the highest bidder, we need to stop it. Hong leaned forward, his fingers still tapping lightly on the table. I'll pull up any records I can find on missing animals in the area. There have been a few incidents over the past few months, but most of them didn't lead anywhere significant. What I can tell you is that this kind of thing is usually done in the shadows. People who are involved in these networks are smart. They don't leave obvious trails. Lan's frustration grew. How do we even start looking? How do we know where to go? I can't just wait around while people are doing this to animals. Hong gave her a reassuring smile. It's not easy, but we have to start somewhere. I'll run a background check on the shelters and the veterinarians in the area. They're often the first places people go when they want to get rid of a pet or get treatment for an injured animal. We might find something that leads us to the right people. Dr. Fook nodded thoughtfully. And we'll keep an eye on Tiao Tiao. We may not know the full story yet, but we can make sure she's safe while we investigate. Lon felt a surge of determination. She wasn't going to let this go. Not now. Not when there were animals like Tiao Tiao who needed her. We'll figure this out, Lon said, her voice firm. I'll do whatever it takes to stop them. As Hong and Dr. Fook exchanged further ideas about the investigation, Lon felt her resolve harden. There was no turning back now. She was in this for the long haul, no matter where it led. She could only hope that, together, they would be able to uncover the truth and put an end to whatever sinister forces were operating in the shadows of the city. The days following her meeting with Hong had been filled with unease and growing frustration for Lon. Although the investigation was just beginning, she could feel the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. Every night, as she sat by Tiao Tiao's side, She couldn't shake the feeling that the dog's past was more complicated than anyone could imagine. The mysterious phone call, the cryptic warning, and now the unsettling discovery of the dog's injury. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, but the picture was still too blurry to make sense of. It was late afternoon when Lan decided to take Tiao Tiao for her regular checkup at the clinic. The weather outside was chilly, with the wind picking up as the sun began to dip below the horizon. Tiao Tiao, as usual, was calm and unbothered by the cold, content to be with Lan. The dog had come so far since the accident, adapting to her new life with patience and resilience. Lan had made it her mission to care for her, to ensure that the trauma of the past wouldn't define her future. Yet, there was a nagging feeling in her gut, a quiet suspicion that something wasn't right. When they arrived at the clinic, Lan was greeted by Dr. Fook, who had always been professional but kind in his approach. He had been the one to tell her that Tiao Tiao's injuries from the accident were severe, but that with time and care, the dog might be able to adjust to life in a wheelchair. Despite the long road ahead, Tiao Tiao was a fighter, and that gave Lan hope. As they went through the usual routine, checking the dog's vitals and performing a few tests, Dr. Fook's expression shifted from his usual calm demeanor to one of concern. "Lan," he began softly, "there's something unusual about this injury. I think it's worth looking into." Lan's heart skipped a beat as she stepped closer. "What do you mean?" Dr. Fook gestured toward Tiao Tiao's back, where the dog's spine was aligned with a subtle but noticeable scar. Lan's breath caught in her throat as she took a closer look. The scar didn't match any of the marks from the car accident that had brought Tiao Tiao into the clinic initially. It was old, uneven, and had a slightly darker hue, as though it had healed improperly, almost as if it had been inflicted intentionally. Lan gently ran her fingers along the edge of the wound, her mind racing. "What is this?" Dr. Fook inspected the scar more closely, his brows furrowing in thought. "This doesn't appear to be from the accident. The injury doesn't match the trauma she suffered when she was hit by the car. This looks like an old wound, possibly from some kind of abuse." Lan's stomach churned at the thought. "Abuse?" Her voice cracked, the horror of the words sinking in. "Yes," Dr. Fook replied. "It's hard to say for sure without running more tests, but the way it healed and the type of scar tissue, it looks like she was subjected to some form of trauma long before she ended up on the streets. Whoever did this to her was intentionally trying to harm her. It's possible this is a sign of mistreatment, maybe even part of something more sinister." Lan's hands trembled as she looked down at Tiao Tiao, who seemed blissfully unaware of the growing tension in the room. She had been through so much already, and now, to discover that her past might have been filled with cruelty, it was unbearable. Tiao Tiao was no longer just a dog that had been hit by a car. She was a victim of something much darker, something more insidious. Tears welled up in Lan's eyes as she gently stroked the dog's fur. How could anyone do this to her? She's so sweet, so gentle. She didn't deserve this. Dr. Fook placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I know, Lan. It's heartbreaking, but we have to face the truth. Tiao Tiao may have been part of something we don't fully understand yet. Whatever happened to her before she came into your care, it was brutal." Lan took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay composed. "This changes everything, doesn't it?" Dr. Fook nodded. "It does. If she was abused in this way, it's possible she was part of an illegal operation, perhaps the one you were warned about. I know you've been investigating this animal trafficking ring, and this wound could be the key to understanding what happened to her." Lan's resolve solidified. The more she learned, the clearer it became that Tiao Tiao was caught up in something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The phone call had been right. There was more to Tiao Tiao's past than just an unfortunate accident. "I need to find out who did this to her," Lan said, her voice steady despite the anger rising inside her. "I need to know where she came from and why they hurt her." Dr. Fook looked at her with understanding in his eyes. "You're not alone in this, Lan. We'll figure it out together. I'll help you get the tests done to determine more about the injury, and I can use my connections to dig deeper into her past. But we'll need to be cautious. Whoever was behind this, they're likely dangerous. This isn't something we can just confront without knowing who we're dealing with." Lan nodded, her determination only growing stronger. "I don't care how dangerous it is. Tiao Tiao deserves justice. I'm not going to let this go. As they discussed the next steps, Lan's mind kept returning to the injury, the old wound that had been hidden beneath Tiao Tiao's fur, unnoticed by anyone until now. It wasn't just a physical scar. It was a symbol of everything that had been wrong with the world that allowed such cruelty to happen. The fact that Tiao Tiao had survived it, had found her way to Lan, gave Lan a glimmer of hope. She knew that she had to do whatever it took to uncover the truth and stop the people responsible. After the checkup, Lan and Dr. Fook spent some time discussing potential leads, but as they spoke, Lan's mind wandered back to the day she first saw Tiao Tiao, lying helplessly on the street, abandoned and broken. The thought that someone had hurt this dog intentionally, for their own purposes, filled her with a rage that was hard to contain. But more than anger, there was a sense of responsibility. Tiao Tiao was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was a symbol of everything wrong with the world, and Lan wasn't going to stand by while others suffered the same fate. She would find out who was behind this. She would bring them to justice. Lan took one last look at Tiao Tiao, whose eyes met hers with a quiet trust. In that moment, she knew there was no turning back. She would not rest until the truth was uncovered. The days following Tiao Tiao's discovery of her old injury were filled with a renewed sense of urgency. Lan, Dr. Fook, and Hong knew they were onto something bigger than they could have imagined. The scar on Tiao Tiao's back, the signs of abuse, and the cryptic warning about an illegal animal trafficking ring all seemed to converge into one unthinkable truth. Tiao Tiao had been a victim of something far more sinister than just a stray dog in need of help. As they began to piece together the details, the trio decided to expand their investigation. If Tiao Tiao's past was connected to something more criminal, they had to reach out to people who might know more. This wasn't just a case of animal abuse. This was a network of exploitation, and it needed to be shut down before more innocent animals suffered. Lan knew they couldn't do this alone. They needed resources, connections, and the expertise of those who had worked with animal welfare for years. They needed information from people who had seen the darker side of the city, the ones who fought against the very systems that allowed cruelty to flourish in the shadows. The first step was to contact local animal rights groups. Lan spent hours calling shelters, rescue organizations, and animal advocacy groups across the city. She reached out to anyone who might have any leads on the mysterious trafficking ring. After days of phone calls, emails, and meeting with volunteers, a few key pieces of the puzzle began to emerge. One group, the New York Animal Welfare Coalition, NYWC, was particularly helpful. They had a history of investigating illegal animal trafficking in the city and had long suspected that certain underground operations were responsible for the sudden increase in missing pets and stray animals. They shared disturbing details with Lan, stories of pets being stolen from people's homes, of strays vanishing without a trace, of animals being tortured in secret locations, only to be sold to criminal syndicates for profit. The more they learned, the more the dots connected. It became clear that what they were dealing with wasn't just a random crime. It was an organized and well-hidden operation. The NYWC had heard rumors about a shadowy organization that had been operating in the city for years, and while they had never been able to gather enough evidence to bring the operation down, they had kept track of unusual animal disappearances. Lan's heart sank as she listened to the stories of pets found mutilated, their bodies abandoned, the telltale signs of abuse and torture left behind. The groups had been powerless to stop it, but Lan knew she couldn't give up now. Tiao Tiao's story was only the beginning. She had to follow the trail. Lan shared everything she had learned with Dr. Fook and Hong, who both agreed that they needed to dig deeper. Dr. Fook, who had experience working with animals in need, knew the importance of finding the right people. He began reaching out to his network of veterinarians, hoping to uncover any leads. One contact in particular, a colleague named Dr. May, had treated several animals that had been brought in with injuries consistent with the kind of abuse Lan and Dr. Fook suspected. She recalled one case, a dog that had been severely beaten and tortured, then found with no tags or identification. The animal had been placed in a shelter, but no one had come forward to claim it. After several months, the dog had mysteriously disappeared. Dr. May's testimony was chilling. It wasn't the first time something like that happened, she told Dr. Fook over the phone. Animals would be brought in, sometimes unconscious, other times barely hanging on to life, with injuries that were far beyond what a normal car accident could cause. It's hard to prove, but we suspected something bigger was at play. I just wish we could have done more. The more they learned from Dr. May and other veterinarians, the more they realized they were up against something organized. Lan's stomach churned at the thought of how many animals had been caught in the web of this sinister operation. The details of the abuse were sickening. Some animals had been tortured for months, kept in cages, forced to endure unimaginable pain before being sold to those with dark intentions. Others were used in illegal animal testing, their lives and bodies discarded like commodities. As they expanded their investigation, the pieces began to fit together. A pattern began to emerge, one that Lon found hard to ignore. The trafficking ring was active not just in New York, but in other major cities across the country. The victims were not limited to stray animals or unwanted pets. Many of the stolen animals were family pets, carefully chosen from neighborhoods with a high concentration of wealthy residents. They were taken, tortured, and sold for a premium. An operation so ruthless that it made Lan's blood run cold. Hong, who had been gathering information from his contacts in the NYPD, was able to shed light on some of the law enforcement challenges involved. There were reports of missing pets that never made it to the police stations. Pets stolen from homes were often classified as lost, rather than part of a criminal operation, and there was no real way to connect the disappearances to a larger network. Hong had been investigating one of these rings for months, but they had always remained one step ahead of the law. There's no clear-cut evidence yet, but we know it's happening, Hong said, frustration creeping into his voice. These people are careful. They cover their tracks. But it's only a matter of time before someone slips up. Lan's mind was spinning with all the information they had uncovered, but there was still something missing. The traffickers were careful, but they were not infallible. They had to have made a mistake somewhere, left behind a trail that Lon and her team could follow. But where? The answer came unexpectedly during a visit to an animal shelter. Lon had been talking to a few workers there about any unusual cases they had received when one of them mentioned an incident from a few weeks ago. A young puppy had been brought in, badly injured and traumatized, but with a microchip that led back to a wealthy neighborhood. The puppy's owner had been frantic, but when the shelter staff tried to call her back, there was no response. The puppy was eventually adopted out, but the mysterious circumstances surrounding the case bothered Lon. She began to wonder if the traffickers were using microchips to track animals, and the idea made her skin crawl. By now, Lon knew they had to move quickly. They had enough pieces to take the next step. They had to infiltrate the trafficking network. With the help of Hong and the NYWC, Lon began plotting a plan to expose the dark web of animal exploitation. She would need to be cautious, smart, and above all, patient. The clock was ticking, and the people responsible for the abuse of animals like Tiao Tiao were still out there. The investigation had grown more dangerous, and the stakes were higher than ever. But Lon couldn't back down. Not when so many innocent lives were at risk. She would do whatever it took to bring the criminals to justice, even if it meant putting herself in danger. Tiao Tiao, sitting by her side as she made her plans, was her anchor. The bond they shared was unbreakable, and with every new piece of information, Lon felt a deepened sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for justice, she was fighting for Tiao Tiao, for the animals who couldn't speak for themselves, and for a future where no more creatures would suffer like this. This was no longer just an investigation, it was a mission, and Lon was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. Lon sat in the dimly lit room, her fingers tapping nervously on the edge of the table. The weight of the plan they had put together pressed heavily on her shoulders. It was risky, dangerous, and potentially life-threatening, but it was their only shot at exposing the animal trafficking ring they had been investigating for weeks. The clock was ticking, and with every passing day, they knew more animals were suffering, just like Tiao Tiao had. Dr. Fook, Hong, and Lon had spent hours going over the details of their plan. They had tracked down a facility in the outskirts of the city, a seemingly innocuous warehouse that had raised too many red flags. The NYWC had gathered intelligence suggesting that this was the place where stolen animals were kept before being transported to buyers. It wasn't just an animal trafficking hub. It was a torture chamber, a place where innocent creatures were held against their will, subjected to pain for profit. Lon couldn't let that stand. Hong had contacted a few trusted members of the NYPD to monitor the area discreetly, but they didn't have the manpower to take action yet. Lon knew this was a job that needed to be done under the radar. The last thing they needed was to tip off the criminals that they were onto them. They had to be swift, precise, and, most importantly, careful. The plan was simple. Lon and Dr. Fook would pose as potential buyers interested in purchasing animals, while Hong would act as their lookout, stationed in a nearby alley to monitor the situation. They had obtained a fake identity for the mission. A wealthy businesswoman looking to acquire animals for an undisclosed project. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get them inside. Once they were in, they would gather whatever evidence they could find and get out before anyone noticed. The plan had been set, but there was an underlying sense of unease that none of them could shake. The traffickers were ruthless, and they wouldn't hesitate to strike if they suspected anything. As Lon prepared to leave the house, Tiao Tiao, sensing the tension in the air, followed her to the door, her eyes full of silent trust. "I'll be back soon, girl," Lon whispered, bending down to give the dog a reassuring pat on the head. The warmth of Tiao Tiao's gaze steadied her nerves, but deep down, Lon knew there was no turning back now. The drive to the facility was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The wind howled outside the car, sending gusts of cold air through the cracked windows. The closer they got to the warehouse, the more Lan's heart began to race. She gripped the seat, trying to steady her breathing. This was it, the moment that could change everything. When they arrived, Hong took his position across the street, hidden behind a dumpster, his eyes scanning the area. Lon and Dr. Fook walked up to the large metal doors of the warehouse. The facility was surrounded by a high fence topped with barbed wire, and the air was thick with the scent of industrial chemicals and decay. The exterior looked like nothing more than a rundown storage unit, but Lon knew better. Behind those doors lay the answers they needed. A man appeared at the door, his face cold and unreadable. He was tall, wearing a black jacket and dark sunglasses, even though the sky was overcast. His eyes flicked over to Lon and Dr. Fook, and for a moment, Lon felt the weight of his gaze, as though he could see right through her disguise. But the man said nothing, only stepped aside and gestured for them to enter. "Follow my lead," Dr. Fook whispered, and Lon nodded, stepping past the man into the darkness of the warehouse. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of sweat and fear. The warehouse was vast, filled with metal cages stacked on top of each other, some of which contained animals, cats, dogs, and even small monkeys, each one huddling in the corner of its cage, their eyes wide with terror. The sight struck Lon like a punch to the gut. She had seen the pictures, heard the stories, but nothing could prepare her for the reality of it. These were the victims of the trafficking ring, the ones who hadn't been lucky enough to escape. They were led through a maze of cages and makeshift rooms, their footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness of the facility. The man who had greeted them kept a steady pace ahead, not looking back, but Lon could feel the tension rising. They were being watched, and she knew they didn't have much time before things went south. As they reached the back of the warehouse, the man stopped in front of a large office door. He knocked once, then opened it without waiting for a response. Inside, a man sat behind a desk, flipping through papers. His face was familiar. Lon had seen a photo of him in the files they had uncovered during their investigation. He was the leader of the trafficking ring, the one responsible for orchestrating the thefts and the torture. "Mr. Chun, these are the buyers I told you about," the man said, his voice low. Mr. Chen didn't look up immediately but motioned for them to take a seat. Lan's heart pounded in her chest as she took a seat, forcing herself to remain calm. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, but she knew this was their only chance. Dr. Fook exchanged a few pleasantries with Mr. Chun, trying to keep the conversation going while Lon discreetly scanned the room. She was looking for anything that could serve as evidence, a ledger, a computer, anything that could help expose the operation. But before she could find anything, there was a sudden noise, footsteps, then the sound of doors slamming open. Lon froze. The man who had led them in earlier rushed back into the room, his face contorted with panic. "They know," he whispered urgently. "Someone tipped them off." Before Lon could react, the door behind them swung open, and a group of men burst into the room, guns raised. They had been discovered. "Get on the ground," one of the men shouted. But Lon was already moving. She knew the moment they had been compromised, and the only way out was through the back door. She grabbed Dr. Fuchs' arm, pulling him toward the exit, but the men were faster. A struggle ensued, and Lan's heart raced as she fought to keep her composure. In the chaos, she managed to grab a flash drive from Mr. Chin's desk, shoving it into her pocket before being shoved toward the door. The men were closing in, but just as they reached them, Hong's voice echoed through the warehouse. "Move. Now." Hong had come to their rescue. With his help, they managed to break free from the facility and flee into the night, the sound of pursuit following close behind. They ran through the back alleys, adrenaline fueling their every step, until they finally reached the safety of their car. Lan's chest heaved with exhaustion, her mind racing as she clutched the flash drive tightly in her hand. They had escaped, but just barely. The evidence they had gathered was crucial. It could bring the entire operation crashing down. But for now, they had to lay low and regroup. The trap had been set, but it was far from over. The night after the warehouse attack was the longest Lon had ever experienced. The physical pain of the ambush was manageable, but the emotional toll was something else entirely. They had been so close. They had gathered crucial evidence about the animal trafficking ring, but in a split second, their progress had been jeopardized. Even now, as she sat in the dimly lit office with Dr. Fook and Hong, Lon couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Dr. Fook leaned over the table, his hand wrapped around a cup of coffee, his expression a mixture of frustration and resolve. Hong, on the other hand, was reviewing the documents they had managed to retrieve from the warehouse during their escape. As Lon glanced between the two of them, she couldn't help but feel a sense of determination bubbling up within her. "We can't let this go," she said, her voice steady despite the anxiety gnawing at her. "The attack was a warning, but it only solidifies the need for us to move forward. We have to finish this, for Tiao Tiao and all the others." Dr. Fook nodded in agreement. "You're right. We have to make sure these people don't get away with what they've done. But we need to be strategic. Whoever is behind this is not going to give up easily." Hong's eyes darkened as he looked at a particular set of documents on the table. "I think I found something," he said, his voice low. "Take a look at this." Lon stood up and walked over to where Hong was sitting. He handed her a folder, the top page showing a list of corporate invoices. The name of the company stood out immediately, Verilux, a massive US-based corporation known for its luxurious line of skincare and cosmetic products. Lon had used their products herself in the past, and the thought that they might be involved in something so heinous sent a chill down her spine. Hong pointed to a series of transactions detailed in the invoices. "These payments, they're for animal-derived ingredients. Ingredients that are not listed on the company's public reports. And the amounts are exorbitant. They're sourcing rare animals from this trafficking ring. Tiao Tiao's abusers are likely supplying them." Lan's heart sank. The pieces were falling into place, but the enormity of the situation was almost overwhelming. A corporation that prided itself on luxury and beauty was directly involved in the suffering of innocent animals. The cruelty was no longer an isolated crime. It was part of a massive, well-funded operation that spanned continents. "They're buying ingredients obtained through abuse and trafficking," Lon said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is big. This is the evidence we need to take them down." "But we need more," Dr. Fook said. "This is just a paper trail. We need to expose the connection between the trafficking ring and Verilux. Without that, it could all be dismissed as coincidence or fabricated evidence." Lon nodded, deep in thought. "We need a confession. We need someone inside Verilux to talk. If we can find a whistleblower or someone willing to testify, we'll have them. But who would be willing to risk everything?" Hong's face lit up with an idea. "What if we reach out to people already speaking out against the company? Animal rights groups, activists, anyone who might have an axe to grind with them. We can't do this alone. But together with the media's help, we can expose the whole operation." The three of them spent the next few hours mapping out a plan. They identified key animal rights organizations that were already advocating against Verilux for other, unrelated issues, companies with murky sourcing practices or non-transparent supply chains. If they could partner with these organizations, It would give them both leverage and a public platform. It would also be harder for the corporation to simply brush them aside. At the same time, Lon worked on gathering more information. She reviewed the rest of the documents, looking for further evidence that could tie the corporation to the trafficking ring. Hong worked the phones, reaching out to contacts he had in law enforcement. He knew people who had investigated Vera Lux's ties to controversial practices before. If anyone could find an insider, it would be Hong. By morning, they had managed to secure a meeting with an influential journalist, Maria Winters, who had made a name for herself exposing corporate corruption. She had been following Vera Lux for a while, after receiving anonymous tips about their questionable business practices. But the trail had gone cold for her until now. Lon and Dr. Fook met Maria at a local cafe, trying to stay under the radar. The tension in the air was palpable as they sat across from each other, the weight of their discovery hanging heavily. "We have information that could take down Vera Lux," Lon said, cutting straight to the point. "It involves a trafficking ring and their involvement in sourcing animal-derived ingredients for their products. We have evidence. We need your help to get it out there." Maria leaned in, her interest piqued. "How do you know this? Are you certain about the connection?" Lon explained everything. How they had traced the animal trafficking ring, how they had discovered the invoices, and the connection to Vera Lux. She handed Maria the documents they had recovered, laying everything on the table. Maria flipped through the files carefully, her face grim as she processed the information. "This is huge. If this is true, it could ruin Vera Lux. But we need more than just paper. We need proof, something the public can rally behind." Lon knew she had to act fast. Time was running out. She could feel the weight of their discovery pressing down on her. "We've been trying to get a confession from someone within the company. We have contacts who are willing to go public, but we need you to help us give this the exposure it deserves." Maria nodded slowly. "I'll help you, but we need a solid story. No one will care about animal abuse unless we make it about corporate greed. And I'll need to run some checks first. If we're going after a major company like Vera Lux, I need to be sure this won't backfire." Lon understood the risk involved, but there was no going back. They had uncovered the truth, and now it was time to fight for it. As Maria left, Lon felt a sense of purpose she hadn't had in days. The next steps were clear. They would bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. The animal trafficking ring had to be stopped, and Vera Lux needed to answer for its actions. For Tiao Tiao, for all the animals that had been victims, for the truth. Lon knew the fight ahead wouldn't be easy. But with their allies in the media and the evidence in hand, they were ready to take on the corporate giant. The secret was uncovered. Now, it was time for the world to know. The night was cold, the kind of biting chill that seeped into your bones. Lon, Dr. Fook, and Hong stood just outside a dilapidated warehouse at the edge of the city, where they had tracked the animal trafficking ring to its hideout. The air was thick with tension. Every step they took toward the location feeling like a step deeper into the heart of darkness. This was it, the final confrontation. There was no turning back now. Lon could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat a reminder of everything that had brought them here. Tiao Tiao's suffering, the whispers of animal abuse, the clues that had led them down this perilous path. But it was more than that. This moment wasn't just about one dog. It was about every animal that had been stolen, tortured, and sold for profit. It was about ending the nightmare that had gone on for far too long. Hong adjusted the strap of his jacket, keeping his hand close to the gun hidden underneath. His expression was hard, and although he tried to mask it, Lon could sense his unease. They knew they were walking into a trap. The criminals they were up against weren't just ruthless. They were organized, and they would stop at nothing to protect their operation. "Stay close," Hong whispered, his voice barely audible. "This could get ugly." Lon nodded, gripping the small flashlight in her hand, as they made their way through the darkened alley toward the back of the warehouse. Dr. Fook, ever the calm presence, kept close behind her, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. They had to be careful. This was no longer just a simple rescue mission. The criminals behind the trafficking ring were armed and dangerous. They reached a side door, slightly ajar. Lon motioned for the others to follow as she pushed it open quietly, just enough to slip inside. The interior was dimly lit, the shadows in every corner making it feel like a scene out of a nightmare. The air smelled of damp concrete, mixed with the sharp scent of industrial chemicals. There was a faint sound of barking in the distance, a noise so unsettling it made Lan's skin crawl. They moved in silence, creeping through the maze of corridors until they arrived at a steel door, a faint light seeping through the cracks beneath. Hong gestured for them to stop and listen. There was the unmistakable sound of voices, a low murmur, punctuated by occasional laughter and barking. The voices were speaking in a language Lan didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakable, confident, relaxed, as if they were in control. Hong motioned for Dr. Fook and Lan to stay back as he approached the door, positioning himself to listen closely. After a few tense moments, he stepped away, his face grim. "They're in there," he said quietly, "and from the sound of it, they're holding animals. We need to be ready." Dr. Fook took a deep breath, his usually composed demeanor now tinged with urgency. "We need to move quickly. If we don't, we may lose the chance to rescue them all." Lan couldn't agree more. The dogs, the innocent animals, were waiting for them. And if there was even a shred of hope that Tiao Tiao was in there, she couldn't afford to hesitate. Hong pulled out a set of lock picks, carefully working on the door. Lan felt a rush of impatience as the seconds ticked by. Finally, the click of the lock echoed in the silence, and the door creaked open just enough for them to slip inside. The sight that greeted them was worse than any of them had imagined. Rows of cages lined the room, each one containing a dog or another animal, many of them looking malnourished and terrified. The air was thick with the smell of fear and decay. Some of the animals were shivering, others stared blankly, as though they had long since given up hope. But in the far corner of the room, Lan's breath caught. There, in a cage by itself, was Tiao Tiao. Her heart twisted as she saw the familiar form of her dog, lying motionless on a dirty blanket in the corner of the cage. Tiao Tiao's once bright eyes were dull and vacant, her body stiff from her paralysis. But what struck Lan even more was the faint scar on the dog's back, the same scar she had discovered earlier, the one that pointed to a history of abuse. Lan stepped forward, but Hong grabbed her arm. "Wait," he whispered. "We need to be smart about this." The criminals, it seemed, had let their guard down. There were two men standing by a table in the center of the room, their attention focused on something they were discussing. Lan and her team had to act fast before they were noticed. Dr. Fook nodded, his face determined. "We need to distract them. I'll go first. Lan, stay behind me, and Hong, keep an eye out." Lan held her breath as Dr. Fook moved quietly to the far side of the room, using a stack of crates to hide his movements. Hong followed close behind, silently pulling out his weapon. Lan stayed low, trying to make herself as invisible as possible. The seconds felt like hours as they waited. Finally, Dr. Fook found his opening. He knocked over a metal barrel with a loud clatter, the noise drawing the attention of the two men. As they turned toward the source of the sound, Lan rushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't have time to think. She only had time to act. With Hong close behind her, she reached Tiao Tiao's cage. The lock was simple enough to open, and as soon as the door swung open, Tiao Tiao let out a faint whimper, but she didn't move. Lan gently scooped the dog into her arms, tears welling up in her eyes as she cradled the fragile creature. "Let's go," Hong urged, his voice tight with urgency. "Now." But just as they turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, and the door slammed open. A tall, imposing figure appeared in the doorway, the leader of the operation. His eyes gleamed with malice as he spotted Lan and the others. "You're too late," he snarled. "This operation doesn't stop because of a few meddling pests. You should have stayed away." With no choice but to confront him, Lan braced herself for what was to come. The standoff had begun. The city lights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows over the grim warehouse where Lan, Dr. Fook, and Hong had just confronted the heart of the animal trafficking operation. The leader of the ring had made a last-ditch effort to stop them, but the law had finally caught up with him. With Hong's sharp reflexes and the weight of the evidence they had gathered, the criminals were now under arrest, and their hideout was raided by the authorities. The police had arrived in time, securing the facility and rescuing the rest of the trapped animals. It had taken months of investigation, countless sleepless nights, and moments of uncertainty. But they had done it. The trafficking network that had tortured and exploited innocent animals was no longer operating in the shadows. The criminals responsible for the horror were now in handcuffs, their empire crumbling under the weight of the truth. Lon sat quietly in the back of the police car, Tiao Tiao resting peacefully on her lap. The dog's breathing had slowed to a calm rhythm, her once vibrant eyes now filled with a quiet, healing trust. Lon couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led them to this moment. From the very first time she had seen Tiao Tiao on the street, broken and abandoned, to the discoveries they had made along the way. The abuse, the trafficking, the horrifying truth. It all seemed surreal. But despite the darkness, there was now light. The light of justice. The car ride was long, but Lon didn't mind the silence. It felt like a moment of peace, a brief respite from the whirlwind of events that had unfolded. The thought that they had exposed the trafficking ring and saved so many animals made her heart swell with a sense of accomplishment. But what mattered most was Tiao Tiao. The dog who had been through so much, who had survived the cruelty of humans, was now on the path to recovery. When they finally reached Dr. Fuchs' clinic, Lon carried Tiao Tiao inside. The vet had been instrumental in their journey, helping them uncover the truth behind the dog's injuries and offering support every step of the way. He had made it clear from the beginning that he would stand by Lon and help her through the toughest of times. Dr. Fuchs smiled warmly as he saw Tiao Tiao in Lan's arms. "She looks better already," he said, his eyes filled with relief. "It's been a long road, but we're getting there. With proper care, I'm confident she'll make a full recovery." Lon nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dr. Fuchs. You've been more than just a vet. You've been a friend, a guide. Thank you." The words felt like a soft release, a breath of gratitude for all the support she had received. Dr. Fuchs' compassion had never wavered, and now it was evident that Tiao Tiao was in the best hands possible. As the days passed, Tiao Tiao's condition improved. She regained strength, and the spark in her eyes returned. Lon was determined to give her the best life she could, to make up for the suffering she had endured. But she knew that Tiao Tiao wasn't the only animal in need of help. There were countless others out there, suffering in silence, waiting for someone to stand up for them. It was then that the idea began to take shape in Lan's mind. She could continue her work, but on a larger scale. The victory over the trafficking ring had shown her just how much was at stake, how much more needed to be done. She could make a real difference in the lives of animals who had nowhere else to turn. A few weeks later, Lon stood in front of an old building in downtown New York, a building she had just purchased with the funds she had saved from her efforts. The sign outside read, "Tiao Tiao's Animal Rescue Center." The thought of opening a place where animals could be rescued, rehabilitated, and cared for until they found loving homes filled her with purpose. It hadn't been easy. Lon had poured her heart and soul into the project, reaching out to local animal rights groups, veterinarians, and volunteers. The center would provide not just shelter for the animals, but also education for the community about the importance of protecting animals from harm. It would be a safe haven for creatures who had suffered at the hands of cruelty, just as Tiao Tiao had. Inside the center, the walls were painted with bright, cheerful colors, and the rooms were filled with comfortable beds and toys for the animals. Lon had made sure to create a space that was as welcoming and healing as possible. There were large play areas for the dogs to run and interact, and a quiet room for the more frightened animals who needed time to adjust. Lon spent her days at the center, working with the animals, overseeing their care, and collaborating with a team of dedicated staff. There were moments of joy, like when a timid dog took its first steps toward trusting a human, or when a cat, once terrified of everything, began to purr contentedly in the safety of its new home. There were also moments of sorrow. Animals who had been too broken, too damaged, to fully recover. But even in those moments, Lon found strength in knowing that they had done everything they could. The phone call from the police that afternoon had been a turning point in her life. The trafficking ring had been dismantled, and its members were facing prosecution. The criminals responsible for the suffering of so many animals would finally be held accountable. But the real victory, Lon knew, wasn't just in the arrests. It was in the lives that had been saved. It was in the future that had been created for animals like Tiao Tiao, who would now know nothing but love and safety. As Lan sat in her office late one evening, looking at the smiling faces of the staff and the animals they had helped, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. It had been a long and difficult journey, one filled with challenges and heartbreak. But it had also been a journey of healing, not just for the animals, but for herself. Tiao Tiao had changed her life, had shown her the power of compassion and the need to fight for what was right. Lan looked at the photo on her desk, Tiao Tiao, sitting proudly by her side, a symbol of resilience and hope. She smiled, knowing that no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, she had made a difference. The fight for justice had been won, and the animals had a voice again. With Tiao Tiao by her side, Lan knew that this was only the beginning. There was still so much to do, so many more lives to save. But she was ready to continue the fight, to keep shining a light on the darkness, and to ensure that no animal would ever again suffer in silence. Justice had been served, and it would keep being served, one animal at a time.